In this episode of FieldLink, we're going to become bean-wise. Today's episode will focus on soybeans. Soybeans have been around for centuries. According to Iowa State University Department of Agronomy, the first users of domesticated soybeans were believed to be by the Chinese in the northeast part of the country, somewhere around the 11th century. The United States leads the world in soybean production at approximately 32% of the total global output. China's ranked fourth. On this episode, we're going to become bean-wise, and we're going to travel across the country, and we'll start off by visiting with agronomist Ryan Lee out of Indiana, as he shares some insights with us about soybean production as it relates to the central part of the U.S. Then we're going to jump over to Nashville, Tennessee, and visit with Jody Lawrence to get a quick commodity update. And then we'll visit with Josh Gaddy, agronomist in North Carolina, and Shane Powers, also an agronomist in the state of Mississippi, and they're going to share some insight around soybean production as it relates to their geographies. Then finally, we'll wrap up with Brad Hammis in Iowa, as Brad shares with us a little insight around a new product called Full Scale for your soybean crop for the 22 year. Stay tuned for FieldLink. With us today on FieldLink is Ryan Lee, an agronomist out of Indiana. Ryan, welcome to FieldLink.
Hey, Bill. Thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Today, we've asked Ryan to stop in and visit with us, share a little more information about soybeans, and to help us better be prepared and become a little bit more bean-wise. There's definitely a huge uptick in the grain market as it relates to soybeans today. The USDA is they're actually talking right now, about implementing some new programs around double cropping for beans this year in order to simply put more soybeans on the marketplace, as there is a little bit of fear that there may be some deficits globally. So to help us better understand soybean production, we're asking Ryan Lee, our agronomist from Indiana, to join us.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, Bill, here in northern Indiana and in Ohio, the story here recently has been just kind of cool and wet weather. There were a couple of windows that popped open, and some farmers hit it really hard and smashed some beans in the ground. And then it turned off cold again. I think we're getting now into a period where planters can roll pretty good. But just thinking about management of soybeans, I think we're going to talk about some fertility questions as well. But if you look at a soybean, 95%, 96% of that soybean is going to come from the air and from sunlight and from water, which is photosynthesis. And so that's the biggest part of the soybean by far and away. That's the part that we want to try and manage the most. That's where we get the most bang for our buck. That's why we talk about, getting earlier planting, branching on our soybeans. So I think that's probably one of the first things we need to think about is just how do we get the most out of the sunlight that we can, how much sunlight can we capture throughout the year. So I think, maybe that might be a good place to start.
Like all crops, soybeans are really important, just like corn and wheat. No matter what crop it is, starting off right with a good fertility program is always important. And soybeans are really no different.
Yeah, for sure. They're not any different, but for whatever reason, we sort of treat them differently. So around this area of the Midwest, it is really common for us to throw fertilizer in front of corn. When I say fertilizer, I mean your potash and your phosphorus fertilizer, and we'll put that on in front of corn. We'll run a corn season, and then we'll plant beans the next year. And the hope is that there will be fertility in the ground for that soybean to pick up after corn. Really, a lot better way of managing that is splitting that dry fertilizer application up into a year-by-year application. And so that doesn't force it. It allows your beans now to not have to scavenge, whatever is left over from the corn. I mean, corn has a pretty good removal of both phosphorus very high, and potash as well. And so, you're asking a lot from soybeans to try and scavenge after a corn crop. So yeah, you're right. spreading some fertility in front of beans, I think, is probably step number one in getting better yield.
Ryan, I think you bring up a really good point. Traditionally, a lot of growers across the country have treated soybeans as kind of that rotation crop in many places that can add a little more nitrogen to my field for the following corn year. The growers view it as, I don't have to put a whole lot of investment into that crop. Ryan, can you walk us through the economics of today's soybean crop? And, these genetics are certainly changing, and this crop can definitely compete much better than it has ever in the past.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, going back to this though, so if you think about, and I look at this a lot as an agronomist, we look at, like tissue samples, soil samples, and where are we getting the most bang for our buck? And if you separate high yielding and low yielding soybeans, and you look at something like a tissue sample, you will find that high yielding beans tend to have higher concentrations of P and K early in the season. And so, that's really differentiating those two yield groups and kind of demonstrating the importance of putting fertility in front of the beans. So, but on the other side, you were talking about them being a little bit cheaper to grow. So out of your macronutrients, you got N, P, and K. So the nitrogen is the part that soybeans really help us out on. So you look at a soybean field, soybeans require more nitrogen per bushel than corn and more nitrogen per acre, quite a bit more nitrogen, but we don't have to put it on because we get that from these symbiotic bacteria that interact with the roots through nodules. If you had to pay for that nitrogen, you wouldn't be as excited about growing soybeans. So, I think trying to encourage that as best we can, that's another way of taking advantage of the economics of soybean.
And I think, Ryan, you bring up a really good point about nodulation and I guess what I'm going to call the free nitrogen process. This year, in a lot of parts of the country, we're a little bit behind in planting. Nothing to get totally concerned about quite yet, but we've got some ground that's fairly wet in certain parts of the country, and that could certainly have an impact on emergence and, just the fact of that plant emerging and getting up and getting going early. Ryan, what are some recommendations from an agronomist standpoint that kind of concerns you around soybeans, especially when we start talking about soybean treatments and inoculations this year?
Let's kind of break them apart. So again, you go back to those tissue samples and you look at high yielding beans, they tend to have higher concentrations of nitrogen the entire season. And I'm talking really early all the way to the end. And so that really is a foundation. Building some nodules is a foundation. A little bit of, too wet weather, too cold of weather. If we've rotated away from soybeans for several seasons, you might not have the bacteria that you need in the soil in order to get good nodulation. And so putting some, inoculant on your beans is really a pretty cheap insurance program, considering, what it would cost if you were going to try and make that, or you were going to try and buy that nitrogen yourself. And so, that really is a key, and you don't get that back. There's really not a way of trying to fertilize beans if you don't start with that foundation. And so that to me is a big key is, throw some inoculum on there. That should be sort of a cheap insurance program.
Of all times, now is really the time to inoculate your soybeans, obviously because of Mother Nature. But hey, everyone's talking about higher fertility prices. And if we can put some cheaper nitrogen back into our soil, into our crop, we really needed to consider some inoculation for our soybeans this year.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's virtually free when you look at the per pound. Yeah. So then the other side of that are these seed treatments, right? So earlier I was talking that a lot of the farmers, or a few of the farmers in our area, really tried to slam beans in. So beans are going to take like 130 or so growing degree days to get out of the ground. So right now here in central Indiana today, I think we've got like a high of the mid 80s and it's going to be a low of 60s. I mean, we're getting 20 to maybe 25 growing degree days per day. So you're talking 5 days, and 5 to 7 days, and those beans are going to be up and out of the ground. On the other hand, just last week, it was like a high of 60 and a low of 48. So, so you're talking, 4 growing degree days per day. That could take 3 or 4 weeks for soybeans to come out of the ground. And by the way, if you did that, you planted 3 or 4 weeks ago and the beans are sitting there, and you plant, yesterday or today, they might emerge at the same time. And the difference is going to be the percentage of emergence that you get. Right, you're gonna lose a lot more when the soil is so cold and wet and all that business. They sat there and they rotted. So there is a really strong argument for having a good soybean seed treatment, particularly when soils are crummy.
It's always good to get out ahead of the curve. Ryan, the key here is no matter where you live, you need to get out and look at your fields just to really see and evaluate how your soybeans are performing at this stage in the game.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, an easy one to do once you get out, you get a couple of trifoliates out there by V2 or so, you should start to see those nodules. And you want to see, a handful of those things that look really healthy. When you cut them open, you want them to see them pink. You really want to see a good spread across the roots. If you're not seeing them on the main taproot, that's probably an indication that you had pretty low bacteria in the field. And again, you should be thinking about an inoculant if you're planting more beans. But yeah, I mean, it's an easy thing to do. Dig up some roots, take a look at it, see how things are progressing.
That's a tough ask for some producers in many cases across the country with compacting, the planting time, and everyone's putting corn in the ground or soybeans, cotton, depending upon where you're at. Taking that extra 30 minutes to walk those fields, that you planted 5 to 10 days ago is really going to be darn critical this year.
Yeah, but man, it's like the most fun. I feel like that's the most fun time when you put some seeds in the ground and you get to walk out there and they're all popping up and moving the soil off the top of them. And
it's like watching a calf being born right in front of your eyes.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I hope guys still enjoy that part. I sure do.
I think that's important. Step back and take that pause. We get so caught up in the process that Mother Nature does some pretty amazing things.
It does. Yeah, it's fun to watch soybeans for sure.
So Ryan, what kind of weed activity or weed pressure are you seeing out there currently?
Yeah, so I think we have our standard. Winter annuals that are always, they're always a problem. Here before too long, we're going to start to see a lot of water hemp pop up. The giant ragweed I know is already coming through, and so I think it's the usual suspects around here. The difference is with our supply challenges. We've really tried to push that burn down and our residual herbicides out as far as we can, which I think that's a good practice. The closer you can get the burn down and the residual to planting, the better, because your clock just starts ticking. The problem is now when we kind of get in a bit of a bind and we're planting fast, sometimes we get ahead of the sprayer. Which is totally fine. I think a lot of our residuals we can still put down as a pre-plant, pre-emergence. So meaning you've planted, but they haven't popped up, so you can still hit them with that pre-emerge residual herbicide. But once those little necks start cracking through the soil, now all of a sudden a bunch of our herbicide choices start to fall off. And when temperatures are this warm, that it's not a lot of time. Like I said, maybe 5, maybe 7 days, and things are going to start cracking through the ground. So I've just been warning us to, really try and manage. It's a big operational hurdle for us to go really fast and keep everything in sync. But that's going to be a critical one, because really, when it comes to the tough weeds, your water hemp, your Palmer amaranth, those things are going to require a residual platform. That's the only way to do a good job in soybeans with those really tough weeds.
Well, Ryan, certainly a lot of challenges for many growers across the country as it relates to their soybean crop currently. But boy, still a good window there. A lot of great opportunities for soybean producers across the U.S. today. Ryan, we want to thank you for your time today and all your advice to help us become more bean wise. We want to thank you for joining us again here on FieldLink.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Bill. Have a good afternoon.
We now welcome Jody Lawrence from the Strategic Trading Advisors in Nashville, Tennessee, for a commodity market update. Jody, welcome to FieldLink.
Thank you for having me back, Bill. Hope everybody's doing well while they're out rolling around in their tractors, pulling their planters, and finally getting some seed in the ground.
Yeah, it's that time of year. And, for some parts of the country, we're certainly a little bit behind in planting, but, it sounds like, good going for most of the country. Jody, USDA, they come out with some pretty big reports recently, and we continue to see some jumping around in the grain market. And, there's also been a lot of reports about some global food shortage, and we're continuing to hear about more soybean crush plants happening to affect that could potentially infect this soybean market as it relates to biofuels. Right now, they're looking at around 14 plants across the United States under construction. Jody, what's going on in the soybean market today?
Well, the soybean market is having a really good day post-report. It's you got old crop up 30, July to 1644. You've got November new crop up 20, trading at exactly $15 as we speak. So big day. And then coming out of yesterday's USDA May update, you would call those numbers neutral, the way they updated it, because the world stocks were a little bit lower. The U.S. stocks, they didn't really trim Brazil and Argentina's production as much as a few people thought they might. So in general, it was pretty much in line, give or take 10 million, 20 million bushels either way, which in the big picture of world bean production is significant when we get to these levels of tight stocks, but we'll give the USDA that margin for error that it's easy to miss a few million bushels here and there. But if you look at what's happening, the bean rally today, you're really starting to look at what was the concern last week while beans were under pressure, was that all of the rain in North Dakota and northern Minnesota was going to put somewhere between 1 and 2.5 million plantable acres under the possibility that all those corn acres got switched to beans. But today's action, because when you're talking about a wetter forecast and the May 20th, and now that today's the 13th, a week from today, you've got some of the more northern areas of the northern plains where their prevent plant insurance starts to kick in. So when you're working through that bean thing, you went from, okay, we're going to add another 1 million acres to beans potentially, to we're very easily could lose 1 million acres or more of corn and not be switched to beans, so the bean number is not getting bigger. And that, to me, is being reflected in today's trade, because you're with November beans, I'm just looking at new crop, you're looking at a hard retest of last week's high, technically looking great, and then you get to a point where you're only about 40 cents from the contract high. So beans look good, and you hit on the renewable fuel push and the biodiesel plants coming on. There's going to be an enormous amount of back-end demand in the fourth quarter of 22 and first quarter of 23 for beans for these plants to crush and process into biofuel. And as we sit here with inflation raging, anything U.S. and the government can support to lower the price of diesel, because diesel futures are trading today at $3.80, and you're well over $5 at the pump across the country. So the sooner the better to start to begin to ease more available biodiesel into the market.
Yeah, it's definitely, like I say, 14 plants currently, projected to be, built here over the next, year or two. So definitely going to impact that soybean demand across the country. Jody, let's shift gears a little bit to the wheat market. Lots of things happening there.
The wheat was the bullish of all the numbers in yesterday's report. The U.S. wheat stocks were 31 million below estimates. The world wheat stocks were right about in line with estimates. And then you project forward to next year because of the terrible quality of the wheat that is coming out right now in Kansas and in the Southern Plains. They've had as bad of a growing season as any of them can remember. The 22-23 ending stocks came in 40 million bushels below. And to give you an idea, that's almost the world wheat stocks as we sit today from this time last year are right at 1 billion bushels lower than a year ago today. So that you've got a tremendous amount of support. July wheat got to 1198 and a half today. The big it has pulled back because it touched limit up 70 cents yesterday after the report. Then you go back to the post-invasion high of 1278, and that really, if you're looking at a chart or you're just talking about things fundamentally, that's really the only upside target you can pick out of it. And when you start talking about new all-time highs, deteriorating U.S. crop conditions, a drought expanding in Europe, and the mess that still is Ukraine and Russia, a lot of bullish factors here, even at almost $12 wheat.
Wow. And, globally, it just continues to, the demand's there. It's just a matter, can we raise it in some key areas, as you touched on, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, some pretty dry spots there. And then obviously some of the challenges we have out through Ukraine. So, Jody, let's take a look at cotton. What do we have happening in the cotton market today?
The report yesterday was kind of interesting because cotton ended up old and new crop both almost up $3 yesterday. They came out with a number that was as expected on the planted acreage, but they came out with a much smaller final yield and ending stocks than expected. So that's why you've got cotton making another run. You've got new crop cotton back up today over 128 a pound, and you go back to last week's contract high of 129.78. You're just within a big buy order of pushing this market up above 130, and really making for a dynamic cotton market as well. The only thing that really pinched cotton for a while was the rolling COVID shutdowns in China. They thought that factory use consumption and their processing of our raw material would be an issue, and I think everybody, just because it's so dry, and you look at the Texas Panhandle donut for the cotton that is either in the ground or about to be, there's some legitimate concerns with new crop cotton, and if with COVID in China seem to be under control, and they're talking about some easing of the restrictions next week. If China comes back with that big stimulus package that they talked about, we already had July cotton trade to 152. There's no real reason December cotton doesn't have potential to go to 150 if the U.S. crop stumbles a little bit.
And finally, how's our corn looking, Jody? A lot of guys asking about corn right now.
December corn made a new contract high today, or in the overnight trade, 758.5. Yesterday's numbers out of the USDA, the shocking number was in February at their economic outlook forecast meeting, they came out with a 181 trendline yield, which adding 4 to last year's record 177, optimistic, but certainly doable if you kind of got a Goldilocks situation with Mother Nature. But we've had anything but that, and the USDA is beginning to be more proactive and realize that they can't just, well, let's wait and see, because things have a way of moderating out. And they lowered yield back to last year's record of 177, and it sounds funny to say, oh yeah, they cut it 4 back to a record yield, and corn was 15 higher, and we're talking about new contract highs. And I think that should highlight for everybody, when you're looking at corn and marketing it and what you're doing in the field, the world needs all the corn that you can get. And if we're at contract highs coming out of a record crop on the way to producing the potential of another record crop, and December corn is trading at contract highs right at 750. That tells you, and everyone I've talked to, from farmer to agronomist, everything, your crop is going to need every bit of love and attention that you can put on it this year, because it's hard not to imagine if you put a program together that works, that you won't make really, really good margins up here where prices are.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely, this is the year to really, I guess, throw the kitchen sink at that corn crop for sure, based on what we're seeing as it relates to today's markets.
Okay, and one thing I would like to add, Bill, is we talked about diesel for a second, but crude is up almost $4 again today. We've had, I guess you could call it a pullback from kind of that 115 area. Just continue to hedge your diesel fuel on any 20, 25 cent breaks that you see in the market, and make sure that you send your oil jobber a really nice Christmas card this year for being in touch to save you some dollars. Because if the last time diesel was this high, crude was at $125 a barrel, and crude's only at 108 now. So there's substantial upside for diesel if crude just goes back to 125, which isn't the all-time high, but certainly too high for what we want to pay. So keep that in mind while you're out there.
Great insight from Jody Lawrence at Strategic Advisors in Nashville. Jody, thanks for joining us here on FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill. Everybody be safe planting.
And we're back with this episode of BeanWise, and we're going to gain some agronomy insight today with agronomist Josh Gaddy from North Carolina and Shane Powers from the state of Mississippi. Guys, welcome to FieldLink.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate you having us on, man.
Yes, sir, Bill. Thank you.
Guys, we're really excited to have you both here today on FieldLink to share some of your thoughts and insight with us as it relates to soybeans. Let's just jump right into it. Josh, you're an agronomist from the state of North Carolina. You cover quite a range. Josh, why don't you share with the audience a little bit about your responsibilities?
Yeah, I'm an agronomist with Helena and cover basically the East Coast from Georgia and Alabama all the way up to Maine, and been here at Helena about 7 years now. So
awesome. And Shane, you're down in Mississippi.
Yes, sir. I'm located in Mississippi. My actual territory goes from North Alabama all the way over to New Mexico. But my primary stomping ground is up and down the river here in our north and south delta. So Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Western Tennessee, the Boot Heel, and the Purchase of Kentucky.
Definitely a lot of soybean acres represented in this geography today, guys. And you're focused on getting a little bit wiser with soybeans. Josh, what's soybean planting progress look like in your region at this point? How are the beans looking?
Well, I would say, Bill, from the guys that I've talked to and all around, it seems like we're ahead of schedule over here. A lot of growers that I know personally are probably got their beans in earlier than they ever have. A lot of them finished planting in April this year, or several that I know, and that's sort of unusually early for us. So it seems like we're ahead of schedule in my area, I would say.
You guys have had some pretty good, planting progress in that part of the country compared to other parts.
Yeah, especially in the South. Now, as we up in the Northeast, which I also cover, it has been colder and wetter up there. But in the South, we've had pretty good weather to run, so we seem to be a little ahead of schedule on planting. And soybeans are just up good, a lot of them, and some aren't even up yet. But I'd say overall we're definitely ahead.
Shane, how about your geography? What are things looking like in the Delta?
Well, south to north, south, we're wrapping up. I feel like I'm a little jealous of Josh here. I feel like we're farther behind than he is ahead. So, depending on where you're standing, we've got guys around where I'm at right now, Cleveland, who are wrapped up soybeans. In Marion, Arkansas, yesterday, those guys are 30% done planting. And that's 2-3 weeks, maybe even a month behind of where we were this time last year. So we're doing the best we can. These rains just keep tripping us up in areas. The guys who've been fortunate enough to stay dry, they're with the game or ahead of the game. But for the most part, I'd say we're tracking behind a couple of weeks.
That's all over the board across the U.S. But that's Mother Nature, and that's the season 22 is turning into right now. Josh, what are some of the key tips that you can share with soybean producers at this time?
At least one of the things I've thought about going into this year is, one of the issues we really face over here, or we've been battling for a number of years, is resistant weeds, particularly Palmer amaranth, and we certainly don't want to give up ground on that this year. I know there's a temptation to try to cut what we can out of our programs to save money because inputs are up, but certainly would hate to see people give up ground on that, because if you do, you're going to be fighting it a lot worse in future years. So I would try to encourage people to stay the course and have a good weed program in place, good pre-emerge program, come back with timely post, and stay on top of that, and just would hate to see people lose ground on the resistant weed front. But that's one thing I've thought about going into this year. But
that's a good advice, Josh. Shane, how about your market? What are some tips that you can share with soybean producers?
I would echo what Josh says. We always want to start with that solid pre and then come back with those posts to make sure we're getting the right chemistry on the acre, to target whatever it is we're going after. I do feel like our guys, in the field, they're some of the best in the business at going out there, scouting that acre and coming up with a good mix of what needs to be applied. We all know that supply and everything has been an issue over the past year, and it's, it may change as we move forward, but right now things still seem to get tight. I'd actually throw in there that, the way to save the most is to only do it once, and a good way to only do it once is to make sure we've got all the right stuff in the tank to start with. We do at Helena offer a spray water sample called AquaLens, which can go in there and help us identify anything that might limit the efficacy of that application. When we add the right things to the tank, we can make sure we kill it the first time, and we don't have to worry about running down that supply for a second application. So my addition to Josh's would be, let's make sure we're getting a water sample on that spray water and making sure we're conditioning it to the point that we're going to get the most activity out of the active that we're applying.
That's a really good tip. Starting off with good water and understanding where you're at is very important, Josh.
Yeah, that's right. I would related to what Shane said there, I've already seen a couple cases this year where growers tried to, trim some of what they were doing on a burn down or a pre-emerge program, and it's going to cost them an extra trip across the field. So anything they thought they would have saved is out the window. So again, if we can do it right the first time, that's usually always the best. So I've already seen that in a couple times already this year. So
I totally agree. Staying with that plan and sticking with that plan is really, really some of the best advice for growers. Shane, you mentioned earlier some little critters are starting to poke their heads up. Nematodes, are you starting to see some of that pressure right now?
We're real early right now in this bean crop, but over the past 2 years, it really feels like that they have become more and more common in the soybeans I'm walking and looking for different problems. They seem to be a pest that we're seeing more consistently across my geography. If you catch them in season, normally that's too late. A lot of times the way that we figure out that we have nematodes here is we'll have an issue. We'll pull soil samples. We'll pull tissue samples. We'll rule out everything else. And that last thing we generally think about is nematodes. And we'll pull a nematode sample there and, what do you know? Here they are. A lot of times we'll use that for planning for the next season. And when planning for that next season, we're talking about seed treatment, a nematicide seed treatment there, to prevent those guys from doing the damage they tend to do. That are looking for a variety that offers some resistance to those nematodes. So it all goes into kind of like the chemistry. It all goes into the planning. We got to set ourselves up to win from the front. And I will say, Bill, absolutely, they are becoming a more common issue throughout my geography. It seems to be as the years kind of roll on.
And from an agronomic standpoint, as I understand it, there's really no saving grace here. Once you identify them, you've got them, and you really need to turn to preventative maintenance mode at that time. Is that pretty accurate?
Well, you can rotate crops to non-host crops and try to starve them out. A lot of times if we got them in cotton or soybeans, we can rotate to corn, depending on what nematode it is. And if that's not a host plant for it, you can reduce those numbers pretty substantially with a year or two of that rotation to that non-host crop.
Right. A good rotation is a good tool, but really it's for the following year, the following season. There's not a lot of in-season, saving solutions. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Bill, one thing I would add in my area related to nematodes, we've sort of had a push to start growing more early maturing varieties here than we typically had. So that would be more like group 4s and real early 5s. And what we find is those varieties do not have as good of a nematode resistance normally as what we had when we were growing group 6 and 7 soybeans. So these early varieties have a lot more yield potential. That's why we're going to them, but they're more vulnerable to nematodes. So it's something we've got to be watching for that I don't think a lot of people are probably paying enough attention to. And we're probably going to see more issues over here as time goes on and we switch to more of these early varieties. So it's a good point that we need to be looking at too.
Based on the start of the season, what are some other tips that you want to share with the growers as we really get into the heart of the growing season?
Well, I would say, think about where we're at, what we've done to this point. There's a couple of things come to mind. One of them I think is on everybody's mind lately or has been our higher fertilizer prices, which has led to some reductions in fertilizer being applied. We all know we're trying to get the most out of those seeds we're planting. We want that return on investment. So I would say make sure on those acres where we're reducing fertilizer applications or we're really trying to push yield, even with a 100% fertilizer application, that we're monitoring that crop through the year. I like to do that through our extractor program here at Helena, which is our Helena tissue sampling program, where we actually monitor nutrient levels in the crop. When we identify things that are low there or need for that plant, we can make applications during the season foliar applied to supplement what went out in the soil. We're not trying to replace that soil applied application at all 100%. We're just trying to supplement and kind of bridge the gap where we may have left that crop a little bit short. You think about soybean, something like a soybean, the demand it has for a nutrient like potassium is huge. We do a little cut in there or we get dry and all of a sudden that plant can't get the potassium that it needs at the time it needs it most. And now we have a problem. So timing those foliar applications and those extractor tissue samples to tell us the most that it can about that crop and what it needs, and then making that application when it needs it. I think that's a great way for us to maximize our yields and get the most out of what we're putting into that crop. Josh?
No, I agree, Shane. I mean, I think, and even if a grower, a lot of growers probably have cut some upfront fertility this year. And so I think it's real important to keep an eye on the crop, monitor it through extractor and make sure we're still meeting crop needs. But even if they didn't, with the yields we're pushing for today, there's so much demand that even in previous years, we see a lot of high yield soybeans where toward the end of the season, when they go into pod field, we're running out of potash. So especially, so it's something that I think monitoring with extractors a real smart move this year, especially. But
I think you're absolutely right. Fertility has been a very hot topic, obviously, for many growers for the last several months. And, in many cases, their decisions have been made. So now that the seed, for the most part, in the ground are going to be going into the ground shortly, now we need to monitor that in order to feed the plant the best way that we can. The other thing that we talk about, guys, in some of these other markets where there's been an awful lot of moisture is we really do need to be thinking about this and keeping our eyes out on funguses and what that market might look like moving into the bulk of the growing season. Josh, what's some advice that you can share with growers as it relates to fungicides that we should be considering to take a look at for the 22 crop?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned earlier, especially now that we're growing more of these early varieties, what happens when you move those early maturing varieties south is they're maturing when it's hot and humid, and they're much more prone to get like pod rot, Phomopsis seed decay, those kind of things. And so we believe that a fungicide is just almost a necessity on growing early maturing soybeans in the South. So that's certainly somewhere that I wouldn't want to cut this year. I think that needs to stay in your program no matter what. And so I don't know if you got anything on that, Shane, but that's sort of my thought.
No, absolutely. Here in the Mid-South and really across the South, we are a perfect environment for the disease that tries to attack these plants out there. And anything that we can do to help that plant fend that disease off, keep it happy and healthy, let it put its energy into producing that yield that we want and not just fighting disease, I think that we need to be doing. A couple of modes of action there. You want some curative, you want some preventative, but I believe that a fungicide is something that's going to give you a return. And, if we're really pushing yields, I want that plant happy all the time, and that's going to help us get to that point. I did want to add on the nutrient side, we talked about extractor, but if you have soil test on an acre through our high ground platform, or if you have some of our guys pulling just composite samples on you, we talk about the big ones, the N, the P, the K a lot. Micronutrients are really big. The plants don't need them in as large quantities, but they're just as important to that plant. And we do offer a lot of solutions to micronutrients, foliar, that can actually help carry that crop to the place you want it to be from a yield standpoint. So I would say, please don't sleep on the micronutrients, especially as we're trying to push these yields. Because lacking one of those could be just as detrimental as lacking one of the big ones. So keep your eyes on those as well.
Guys, I want to thank you both for joining us here today on FieldLink and helping us all become a little more bean wise.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for joining us on FieldLink. And with us today on FieldLink is Brad Hammes. Brad is a Helena product specialist out of Iowa. Brad, welcome to FieldLink.
Thanks, Bill.
Well, Brad, there's a lot going around as far as soybeans are concerned. Growers are looking for ways to really maximize their yield this year. And boy, it looks like a pretty good opportunity to put a little extra cash in our pockets for many producers. So, Brad, tell us a little bit about this new product, Full Scale, and how it can benefit soybean producers.
Yeah, Bill, you're right. There haven't been many opportunities in the last 10 to 20 years for a grower to be able to see some gains and some financial opportunities, some profitability like we have the opportunity to do with this year based on commodity prices that you guys just heard about from Jody Lawrence. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interest in a lot of products. And the one I want to talk about today is Full Scale, like you mentioned, of how can we get a couple extra bushels? What is that next step maybe that we could look at to try to really enhance that yield? Or if you've been stuck, you've been trying to find ways to increase your yields for several years. You've done some different things and you can't quite get past the threshold. that's really, I think, a good opportunity where full scale might be that tool, that key to unlocking that next, 2 to 4 or 5 bushels of yield. And you look at things like that this year, and that type of yield increase is going to be significant dollars in profitability for a grower.
Tell us a little bit about full scale. What actually is full scale, and what makes up this particular product?
Yeah, so full scale is a newer product to us. We've had it for several years. I think I've been looking at it for maybe 4 seasons now across the Midwest and really some of the key soybean producing areas. And it's the next product in our plant extract line of products. We have a handful of those now, and this one is geared toward the reproductive application timing. But one of the things that I've learned throughout my career really has been that Mother Nature wins. Mother Nature's going to find a way, whether that's, when I first learned about thought about that as an idea, it was about resistance to various pest management steps and management tools that we had. But now as I apply that same thought into crop production and to trying to get more bushels, what I think about when I think about full scale is if you think about plants around the world, about the only environment that you could come up with where there isn't plant life is going to be Antarctica or maybe somewhere in the far Arctic North. And so when you put that into context, there's no stress that a crop might realistically be exposed to that nature hasn't found a way to not only survive in, but really to thrive in. And that could be, an arid desert. That could be, not quite the tree line, but high alpine, arid environments. That could be saline, cold, hot, dry. You name the type of stress, and there has been a plant that has found a way to adapt to that. And so the thought with these plant extract-based products is most plant biology, when you get down to the real basics of it, is pretty similar. You've got photosynthesis, and there's a couple different ways that plants do that. You've got a couple different types of growth habits, being monocots and dicots. But a lot of the processes in plants are pretty uniform, right? The way that they transpire, the way that they, like I said, create and use energy. And so those plants that have adapted to those extreme environments have the same processes as what we're trying to grow in our fields, when we're trying to grow a crop of soybeans. And so if we can find what is it about that plant that grew in that hot, arid environment that allowed it to do that, and take that chemical signal, that extract from that plant, and apply it to our beans, that's going to give our crop then a better chance of being able to manage through that type of environment. And what we really find with a product like Full Scale is that we're selecting for what we tried to find in nature when this product was developed, were what plants do an exceptional job of moving nutrients into their fruiting structures. So which plants, to put it in, I want to get into that soybean context, which plants have done the best job of translocating nutrients and energies into a pod in this example? How can we magnify or increase the ability of a plant, of a soybean, to move nutrients into its pods and get heavier beans and more beans that translate into bushels as we're trying to manage our crops that way?
The scientists who developed Full Scale identified some of the really good parts of different species and then pulled them all together and said, let's build up some amazing formulation, which makes up Full Scale, that benefits soybeans. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And the really interesting thing about soybeans as it pertains to a product like Full Scale is there are some different benefits that are given. It's not just one extract, and that's one of the things that makes Full Scale maybe even a little bit more robust than some other products that have been positioned in that space, is that it's not just one extract targeted toward one benefit. So things that we see with Full Scale is we see an increased retention of pods. So we don't abort as many pods and we fill more seed positions. But then the biggest benefit we get is in seed fill and increasing that test weight. And so going back to the really interesting thing about soybean biology is you're going to make an application sometime in that reproductive timing earlier on, closer to that probably R2 time frame or whatever you're going out with your first fungicide pass in your soybeans. And that bean plant is trying to do a whole lot of different things still, right? At that point of the season, it's still growing new leaves. It's certainly putting on more flowers. It's turning those flowers into pods, and eventually it's also going to be filling seeds a little bit later in the season. And so if you think about what are the reasons, or what are the things that cause soybeans to abort those flowers and have fewer pods, there's different stresses that are going to be involved in that, like nutritional stress, right? If the plant doesn't, I don't mean to personify it, but if the plant doesn't believe that it has enough nutrients to retain a pod and be able to produce viable seed out of it, it's going to abort that flower. That's the reason that happens is a perceived lack of ability of finishing that process. And so when we take extracts from plants that are prolific seed producers and plants that are exceptional at translocating and remobilizing the nutrients from within the plant, those are some different types of things where, we not only see that increase in yield, but really it's the reasons behind why that is, I think, that really helps. So if we're in a phase of development where nutritional stress as related to pod retention is a factor, we can retain some more of those pods. If it's turning those pods into, maintaining all the seeding positions in them, so there's a lot of different benefits that can be given from full scale based on the different types of extracts, depending on what that limiting factor is. But ultimately it's about producing more harvestable and heavier pods at the end, or seeds at the end of the season. Going back to that, I always like to keep things simple, and that yield algorithm for soybeans, it's how many seeds per acre, really, when you break it down, and weight per seed. And you get to that by how many plants, how many pods, and whatnot. But really, it's how many seeds can we get per acre to harvest, and then how much do they weigh?
And that's what growers really need to understand is, what's really important part of full scale is it sounds like we're putting more weight into the seed.
Yep, I guess that's the benefit of, I always thought it's an interesting combination that a bushel is a measure of volume, but we measure bushels in weights based on that standard. So the more weight we can get, that'll be a direct translation into bushels. And when we think about some of the key nutrients that drive that late yield and that ability to increase that test weight, some of the research that our Helena folks like Dr. Willoughby have shown and really been talking about for a number of years is how can we get more phosphorus and zinc into that plant late. And one of the great things that came out when Full Scale was launched was information about how much those two nutrients in particular, the transportation of those, the movement of those is upregulated. So how much greater of an ability that plant is going to have through treatment with Full Scale to move zinc and phosphorus. So you're effectively almost making a late season application of those nutrients because you're helping that plant to be able to remobilize them better to turn those nutrients that were taken up throughout the season into more yield, being more efficient with that process.
So Brad, in addition to the plant extracts that are being added to Full Scale, what else makes up this product?
Bill, that is a great question. There's a lot of products in the marketplace now that are, or a lot more products coming into the marketplace that are plant extract based. And outside of the expertise and selecting and processing those extracts, one of the things that Helena has added into Full Scale is our ENC formulation technology. And that on its own gives me a lot of confidence in a product as being one of our oldest additives that is really something to help enhance plant growth. And that's also, to your other question, going to help with tank mix compatibility and nutrient uptake as well. So we're going to put something else into those extracts that's going to help with uptake and give further benefit to that plant growth. And that's even going to be a yield enhancement even above and beyond what we see with the addition of fungicides. And that's another place where you might see something that's going to talk about that enhanced growth coming out of those types of products. And so these aren't added, or these aren't duplicating that same thing. That's actually adding on to. So that yield range that I mentioned earlier, that probably 2 to 5 bushel yield range that would catch most of what we see, that's going to be on top of the yield increase that we would see with a fungicide. And part of that yield increase is certainly going to be due to ENC formulation technology.
That's one of the things that makes Full Scale, in my understanding, extremely unique versus anything else on the market, because not everyone can offer ENC formulation technology.
It's one of our oldest products and still one of the best that nobody's been able to figure out how to duplicate or come anywhere near, Bill.
So Brad, let me ask you this. It sounds like there's a lot of benefits for growers who are, needing to maximize yield, but what are some of the other challenges? Can we tank mix, for example, Full Scale with other products? Or are there some things that we really need to be paying attention to?
That's one of the things that's great about this product. Not that there aren't challenges or things that we need to take into consideration in management, but tank mixing and compatibility has never been a challenge with this product. I would say the only thing to really think about and when you're evaluating your cropping system is I'm probably not going to recommend that if you've not done other steps, if you've not taken other steps to try to improve your yields in soybeans, full scale probably isn't going to be the first step that I would take. It's going to be that next step in a higher or an advanced yield management system, right? That's going to be the one thing that if you don't have the nutrients in the plant to move, then you're not going to get all the benefit out of full scale. You might still see a yield increase, but it's not going to be that typical probably 2 to 4 or even a little bit higher than that bushel yield response that we would typically see from full scale. And so that's the only, if there's going to be a watch out for it, that would be where I would say is that this is part of a management system that's geared toward higher yields.
So start off strong with a good fertility program, then come back with full scale to finish the crop off.
Yep, that's exactly how I would position that, Bill.
So Brad, timing. When should full scale be applied to a certain crop?
And that's where, typically speaking, with our plant extract products, you're going to get activity in the plant for 2 to 3 weeks after application. So if you would target that R2 to R3 timeframe, which would be pretty common with that first pass fungicide, I think that would be about ideal. Now, you could certainly go earlier than that with the R1 pass if you're in a 2-pass disease management program. And that's one of the things that, we're probably not going to be the driver of an application. I don't know a whole lot of folks that might make a full-scale specific application. It's usually going to be part of a fungicide pass. And so really that's the timing you would want to go would be within that fungicide pass. And I would say even if you were going to do an R1 and R3 for your 2-pass system, I would maybe go a little bit toward that R3 with the benefits that we see in nutrient mobility or remobilization to increase test weight and push yield that way. If you were doing a single pass at the R2 to R3, I would probably stick in that. I wouldn't maybe go as late as R4. You might start to see a little bit of a diminishing gain at that point of the season. But I like that R2 to R3 window personally from what I've seen over the past several years across the Midwest.
Well, Brad, I want to thank you for sharing a little more insight with us today about full scale and helping us become a little bit more bean wise. You can learn more about full scale as well as other soybean tips in this month's edition on FieldLink. Be sure to check out the FieldLink articles on helenaagra.com. Brad, thanks for joining us here on FieldLink.
Thanks a lot, Bill. Best of luck, everyone.
Thanks for joining us here on FieldLink, and we hope that you've become bean wise on this episode.